Bună ziua! Hello everybody, good morning. We're going to have this session in English today. We have with us the Ambassador of Ireland, Mr. McGarry, and we're going to discuss today about the EU as a modernization project. We're going to see what the EU has done for Ireland, and maybe we can extrapolate from there lessons that could be useful for us in our own endeavors of understanding the EU better and shaping it better. So, Mr. Ambassador, I'll start by inviting you to offer us some perspective, some background to the entire discussion today, and then please feel free to write to us, to ask questions. We're going to voice them here, and thank you very much for agreeing to be with us.
Okay, thanks very much, Laura, and it's a pleasure to be here. I suppose just to give some perspective, this year we are marking again the 100th anniversary of our War of Independence. So Ireland up to the early 1920s was a colonial country under British rule. So we had a War of Independence and then a civil war. From our War of Independence started in 1919 and essentially was there was a treaty agreed, and that was in 1922, and a lot of the people who fought in that War of Independence didn't agree with the treaty outcome. So we had a civil war, and that finished in mid-1923. So that left a very broken country. Psychologically, because it was incredibly divisive, and poor just because of the cost of war. And it was an incredibly poor country when we came out of that. We then, of course, went into the 1920s and 1930s, which was the deepest recession in history pretty much up to then. So there was no opportunity. We did certain things in that period that helped us in following years. One was to set up a series of state companies to develop electricity, energy, various things. And then we came through further periods of emigration. We were neutral in the war, in the Second World War, and that was essentially because of our history. And then we went through further periods where we were entirely dependent on the UK economy for our exports. Our 90% of Irish goods were exported to the UK right up to the 1950s. So by the time the 1970s, by the time we had tried to join the EU in 1963, and we tried again, or in the early 60s, the decision that we were not to join was in 1963. And then the second time we tried to join was in 1967, and again we were prevented from joining. So essentially, in 1973, we joined along with the UK. That was very important to us because, firstly, it was important that we joined at the same time as the UK because we were so dependent on their market, and we depended on them making that decision as well and being enabled to join the EU. But in 1973, just to give a sense of where we were in developmental terms, we had 27,000 people in third level education. We had foreign direct investment of 16 million euro equivalent. We had mass unemployment, we had mass immigration, and we had extreme poverty. So what happened since then? How in terms of just in the figures? I think it's up to a few years ago, but and all of this, of course, is we have to respect COVID and what has happened over this terrible year. So these are things that are really pre-COVID and you know, just as we were going, let's say. But we had 230,000 people in third level education. We have 1 million more people employed in the country than we had in 1973. We have foreign direct investment. We have over 1,200 foreign companies operating in Ireland in 3 sectors: pharma, ICT and software. We have 9 of the top 10 companies in the world based in Ireland. So we have undergone economic transformation, social transformation, educational transformation, and essentially we are a completely different country to what we were in 1973.
So you can actually say that the tide has shifted, right? If you're looking at immigration, for example. I
think the nature, when we were young, we were told that Ireland had no natural resources. We made a couple of decisions that were really, really important in developmental terms. In 1968, we brought in free education. Mm-hmm. So that meant that we concentrated on things that were not primary resources. We didn't have metals, we didn't have coal, we didn't have things to manufacture.
But you had people.
But we had people. And people were essentially the only thing we had that we could sell on our, that we could sell to people. Why would you come to Ireland? Because we have an educated workforce. And essentially because we began that in 1968, by the time we were ready to encourage foreign investors into Ireland, we had an educated workforce. And in fact, the type of people who would have emigrated in the 1930s, 40s and 50s from Ireland were essentially low-skilled workers. They worked in the buildings in England, they worked on the railways in England, mainly. They worked in America. When it's funny, the Irish experience in America was better, but a lot of Irish who went to work in America got into the police, the services sector, these type, the nursing, healthcare, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it rings a bell.
These things there are similarities in all of this. So essentially the transformation of the education system and our participation in education was really the catalyst for a lot of this. There were other things. We were a very unhappy society in the 60s and 70s. We had a lot of industrial disputes. We had, and a lot of this was in, again, public sector delivery. We had postal strikes. We had strikes in teacher strikes. We had all of these things that were very disruptive and really very difficult to find a way through. Like, why should more this was all public pay. So how do you deliver more public pay when your private sector was really struggling? And we had a very small private sector. So all of these things meant that there wasn't really a unified idea of what we should do, other than we knew that the EU would be good for us, and we knew we needed to diversify our markets. And that was really we had to get beyond dependence on the UK. And so that decision on education, that decision on people, focusing on people, really because the way the industrial society has changed. And now we've an information society, we have society, we concentrated on pharma as well, and encouraging pharma because it's high education.
And so how was that decision reached? Was there a big debate, a big national debate? Was there consensus? Was there political leadership? Was there
in one sense,
social demand?
The decision on education, and actually the decision to make education free to everyone, was taken by one individual. And it wasn't even a government decision. It was taken by the Minister for Education of the day, who decided that is what we should do.
So it's all about people, right?
So
in the right positions.
It's all about people to a degree. There was an absolute consensus in the country. I think it was 83% of the people in 1973 voted to join the EU. Mm-hmm. So there was an absolute recognition that we needed to do something. There's also a I should have mentioned it earlier, but there's a post-colonial effect. And it's that effect on confidence. Where we came out of a very difficult historic position. Irish people had no confidence. The mantra when I was growing up was, you cannot be successful in Ireland. You had to leave before you could be successful. We had very few entrepreneurs, business people that people respected or looked up to. Really, I'd say one or two. So all of that fed into a sense that we had to do something. If we didn't do something, then things could only get worse, and then you're looking at, are we a failed state? The consensus was around there was a consensus around looking towards, now the 1980s for us were very difficult. We had huge immigration in the 1980s, and it had to do with poor management of the public sector pay in the 1970s. And everybody went through an oil crisis in the West in the 1970s. So these things really made it very difficult. So our initial years of being involved in Europe were very, very difficult. And we had a loss, even the indigenous industry that we had essentially vanished almost overnight. So the consensus really came in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that consensus was around, what did we need to do? We needed to attract foreign direct investment. We needed to have industrial stability. We needed to continue with our education and training programs. And we just needed a few years where we could get things together. But that consensus was
how do you stay on track with all these things? Because, I said it rings a bell. It really rings a bell when you look at Romania and people being disenchanted with the idea of staying here. And then more and more you hear this argument of politicians saying, we give you free education and then you leave. Why should we bear this cost?
Well, I suppose for Ireland is much smaller than Romania. We have, and through those years, our population, we went through population decline after decline after decline. So I think by the 1970s, our population was probably at around 3.5 million. Pre-famine, in 1841, we had a population of 8 million. Prior to that, there was actually immigration for the 20 years before that. It wasn't a new phenomenon. We had 1 million people who emigrated in that period, essentially because of a depressed economy in Ireland pre-famine. But, just all of that means that you had all of this history of emigration in Ireland that was really prolonged and generational. It went through every generation up to the 1980s, and including the 1980s. So what we had to do was the idea of foreign direct investment was to establish industries. We knew we didn't have the capacity within Ireland to generate the money required to establish new industries. So then we had a basic agreement that corporations should be taxed at a lower rate than general taxation. So that would be an attractor. The fact that we had a highly educated workforce, that would be an attractor. We then had to go out to sell this. So we had one of the good things we did in the 1950s. In 1951, we established the Industrial Development Authority, whose job it was to attract investment. But of course, at that time, but it was still there, and it was still trying to do that job. But by the 1980s, it was actually a professional organisation that was well geared up to actually doing this. So we had a very professional approach in America to attracting investment. We did one other thing in the late 1980s, which was very important, and that was set up an industrial services, financial services centre in Dublin. That was only set up around 1991, 92. And again, that was an individual who really wanted to develop that area. But it meant that we had a really strong message when we went to the US to attract foreign direct investment. And they were the things that, and we had a consensus around this. There was a political consensus. People knew, Americans knew, that if they came to Ireland, there was political stability. And actually part of our work on Northern Ireland in terms of, we had a struggle in Northern Ireland that was a violent struggle in the north up to 1998, but that work to end the violence in Northern Ireland really began in the late 1980s. And the first approaches that were made to Sinn Féin and the people that were engaged in that struggle, those approaches were made in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So there was a general view that we really needed to attack all of the difficult areas that we had.
Would you say that nowadays, when times are good, okay, pre-COVID, but even today, given the circumstances, would you say that people are still appreciating what we've been through? And I say we've been through because I look at the EU as a whole. Do you think this public memory is still there?
Well, every generation brings its own things to the dynamic of its time. And we wouldn't expect the people of today to have the same expectations that the people of the 70s had. The experience of our children is vastly different to my experience and our generation's experience growing up.
I mean, in this country, my generation still loves bananas. We think that they are delicious fruits, yeah? If you talk with people from the Western world that have seen bananas forever,
Yes. And
there's nothing special about them.
No, but every generation has its own challenges. And I don't think people are designed to be happy with their lot. People are always stretching and always want something to make their lives better and make their children's lives better. I mean, for our generation and the generation before ours, an awful lot, and a lot of the things that were said at that time had to do with the next generation will be better, we'll have a better time. And the focus on education, while education became free in the 1980s, Irish people, because we had a struggle with immigration, Irish people were always interested in education. And my parents' generation and their parents' generation, like, education was really important. And this actually, again, became a value and became something necessary later on, because countries that were dependent on low-skilled labour and, you know, manufacturing in the West, a lot of those areas ended up with generational unemployment. For Irish people today, I think they have a real expectation that the services that the state delivers will be excellent, that their education system will be excellent, that their health system will be excellent, that the services they receive, that their capacity to earn a good living will be enabled.
But do they put this in connection with being part of the EU?
It's a funny thing. I think for our generation, the EU was the most significant decision that our generation made. I think when you look at polling, and I suppose that's the only thing we can go on, satisfaction with our position in the EU is generally very high, and it can go really, really high depending on the issue of the day. For example, 2 years ago when Brexit was the issue of the day, 93%, a poll was done, 93% of Irish people believed that the EU was good for Ireland. A poll was done this year, I think around March or April. It would have been just after COVID and the EU response to COVID. And that figure, I think, was at around 84%.
So 10 points down.
There is, nobody believes that 93% of the people of Ireland will always believe that the EU is fantastic. But it comes down to what are your core beliefs. And I think there is a very strong majority in Ireland that is pro-EU. I think that is shown in all of the, you know, when there are protests held that might have an anti-EU sense, they're very, very small. I think Irish people appreciate the EU. It's not just what the EU has done for us, but it's what our contribution to the EU as well. I think for a small country, we have helped shape the policies of the EU.
So you feel like the EU is basically enabling your voice?
For a small country that is outside the EU, on the periphery of Europe, and if we don't have multilateral organisations that we can contribute to, like the UN, like the EU, like other multilateral organisations, we have no voice and nobody will listen to us. And we cannot help shape international policy.
How do you get to that point? Because we often hear from many politicians of our region the complaint that the EU is not listening. The EU doesn't take us into account. We're marginal, we're at the periphery of a big empire, to use an outdated term. So Brussels doesn't care. Yeah?
The EU is not simple, and the structures of the EU are not simple. And the reason for that is because you have now 27 countries in the EU. And to have each of the 27 countries cannot come to the table with its own plan and expect that plan to be delivered.
To have it their way. My way or no way.
Oh, no way. So you have 27 countries that have to reach consensus on almost every aspect of life in the EU.
That's tough.
It's tough. And it is, while it is bureaucratic, it's obviously bureaucratic, it's also sensible. There are an awful lot of discussions that are held on every single issue among a range of really professional people who represent us. They might be officials, but they represent our view. And that view is represented after discussions at home. A lot of these discussions are held at official level and whatever in the home country, but national parliaments have a view in all of this, and they give their views on European issues. So I know that this is a mantra of the EU isn't listening and the EU citizens don't have a voice. But a lot of that has to do with communication. How does the EU get its message across in all of this complexity? And where you have essentially three institutions that develop legislation between the Parliament, the Commission and the Council. And these things are complex. And, you know, for the best will in the world, an average citizen, your average citizen, has trouble enough keeping up with the policies that are going on in their own national parliament without the complexity of what is happening at a European level on a lot of the time, it's very technical issues. So that's at one level. The European Council is really, I think, the most democratic organisation you can have. Each leader has a voice that is equal to every other leader. And that is where the big decisions are made and big policy, you know, where Europe has a big policy challenge. It will be addressed in these fora. So these things are difficult, but I think there has always been, and I think the EU recognises this itself, the challenge of communication is actually really difficult. And in the modern world, where everybody has a voice on the internet, it is very, very difficult to get beyond the chatter and get beyond what every person with the typewriter or with the laptop or with the whatever is saying, and to get to the heart of the matter. And that is difficult, and that is a challenge. But that doesn't mean that the organisation isn't valuable.
But I also see things from another lens of how do you make your voice heard as a country? You know, how do you get your message across? Because some would say, and I'll play the devil's advocate, it's all about alliances, it's all about the big countries, it's all about the old EU, and the newcomers are always at the door, and because they're new in the room. How would you answer that? I suppose
the answer I'd have to that is very often, well, there are a couple of things really. Firstly, when a country is joining the EU, it has to get people involved in the EU institutions, and it has to get their own nationals working in EU institutions, and it's really important to have nationals involved at all levels of every institution.
Competent nationals.
Competent nationals with a presence. And I have to say, I had some involvement in this from an Irish perspective in my last job, and I am aware that Romania does very well in this, and that there are a lot of Romanian nationals working with the Commission, working in the various institutions, who are highly competent, and that the actual competitions to get into this work are really, really difficult, and Romanians do really well in it. That's one level. You have to have people, and people have to feel a stake in the institutions. They cannot be so remote that they are meaningless. And so that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, what are the things that really matter to you? What are your defensive interests? And all of us have defensive interests. From Ireland's perspective, our big defensive interest was Brexit. And we had a pretty strong diplomatic offensive across Europe to ensure that all our partners in Europe knew what Brexit meant for us and the implications of Brexit for us. And from that, our partners listened. And the Irish issues were at the centre of the Brexit negotiations, and they still are. So Europe is not...
So it can be done.
It can be done, and it's not remote, and a lot of it has to do with hard work, identifying what you want. and going after what you want and convincing partners that this is necessary for you. And
articulate your message, basically, right? Articulate
your message, and articulate it in a way that convinces, but also you do need allies, there's no doubt. Before the UK left, the UK was our biggest ally in Europe, and that is because our approach to industrial development, to economic and social development was very aligned with the UK approach. And since then, we have had to look at other countries with similar views to ours. And we have gone out and actively tried to build alliances. Now, we are not the same as all other Northern European countries. We will never be aligned on every single issue. But we have to find issues that we are aligned on. And then we can build alliances around issues. Mm-hmm. They won't always be bloc alliances. Like other European member states have kind of bloc alliances where you have the V4 and where you have others who have very strong aligned interests, and that's fine. As long as our interests are heard and that we can contribute to the debate, I think that's all we can do.
That brings me to maybe a more sensitive question of how much diversity can the EU take before it breaks? Or where can we have diversity and on what points we need to feel the same?
Well, in some ways this comes down to your view of the world. And I'll use a little bit from John Hume. John Hume was, people may not be as familiar with him as we in Ireland, as those involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland. But John Hume was a politician from Derry. He was a nationalist politician from Northern Ireland who lived through the 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. And the conflict was a very difficult conflict. It was very personal and very, people knew each other on each side. It wasn't an anonymous sort, it was a very, very personal and deep conflict. And his view of the world was conflict, the basis of conflict is difference. And all conflicts arise from difference. And no two people are the same. But the essence of humanity is difference. So the only way we can resolve and bring peace is to respect difference. So difference is part of what we are. And difference has to be, and diversity has to be part of the respect we show each other. And this how much diversity can Europe take? I mean, how much diversity can we as human beings take? What is diversity? How do we approach diversity? And if we don't respect difference, and if we don't respect diversity, we end up in conflict. So I think all of us within the EU have to manage this. Like there's another, I don't want to quote too much, but there is this,
please do.
there is this thing, it was Orwell who spoke about the energies that provoke reaction at world level, and it had to do with race, religion, war, and these are things that, it's almost your view of the world. If these are the energies that drive human expression, the energy that drive the energy that drives the world, if these are the things, then we always will be in conflict. So there has to be this thing of respecting difference and respecting diversity. Otherwise, you will always end in conflict. And one of the other things that John Hume used to speak about was Europe and the European Union as a peace project. And he saw it fundamentally as a peace project because it has to encompass diversity. And it has to help us manage diversity. And if we don't manage difference and we don't manage diversity, this thing doesn't work and cannot hold together.
So how about the new EU, the new areas where the EU is reaching out, basically moving from purely economic union towards more debatable areas such as rule of law, for example, or gender equality. Are we ready for that? Is the EU built for that? Can the EU handle difference? Should it handle difference in those areas? You know, areas closely related with values and...
Well, I think it's Article 2 of the treaty talks about values, and the basis of EU membership is around values. And
but we mean it.
Well, every country that joined the EU, and many countries joined the EU in more recent, some countries joined the EU in more recent times, all sign up to values. And the values of the EU, when you look at them, are all around respect, dignity, democracy, justice, all of the things, I think, that are related to human dignity. So I think fundamentally we have to think about this as again, people in member states. Are these good things? Are these fundamentally good things, the way we want to live our lives? And I think that's why they're in Article 2, because these are things that people had to think about at the very beginning. What do we stand for? And I think we have to stand for these values. These are the things that I think today, maybe 100 years ago, these were not European values. But I think for Europeans today, these are things that we have to hold. Now, I fully understand that there are countries in Central and Eastern Europe who have come through a different history in the last 50 years than Western Europe. And that history of communism, essentially, was very destructive. And very destructive from meeting people here, I think, more than anything. And I probably wasn't as aware of it, not having lived in a post-communist country before. But it is very, very... It's almost that psychology that we had as a post-colonial country.
It goes into the fabric of the people.
It goes into the fabric of people, and it's this thing of, you know, your belief in yourself and your confidence in yourself. And that does take time. It does take time to get that confidence back. And it does take time to have institutions within your own country that reflect this confidence, and that institutions of a country reflect its people. And you have to have institutions that reflect the values of people. So building those institutions, essentially in a post-communist world, takes time. I mean, these are things that are difficult. And building any democratic institution in a post-conflict, we had it in the 1920s and 30s. When you build your institutions, it's difficult. And having confidence in those institutions is difficult. So I think there's an element here where Europe can bring, like, its values, but it can also share its values. And these values can become embedded in societies over time. They're not going to, people articulating the values and saying this is what we believe. If you don't have the institutions and if you don't have the human capacity to reflect those and to believe them in yourself, then it will take time. And I think that is an element of all of this, time.
But is this different history acknowledged within the EU? Or do we just pretend we're all the same? Because I have to say, often I have a sense of us ignoring the differences, or maybe just putting them under the carpet, thinking that we would be better off if we don't talk about our recent past. And then one day you discover you can't move on because something is dragging you behind, and it's those things that you never thought about. It's like in life.
That's interesting. Just to get to that first point, is the EU putting it under the carpet? I don't think so. I think in all of the things, and these aren't secrets. I mean, Poland has been in an Article 7 process. Hungary has been in an Article 7 process. These are processes where rule of law issues have to be addressed. Romania at one time was close to being in a rule of law process. These are, I think the EU is therefore saying, really, you have to uphold European values. And okay, the mechanisms are difficult to do this. They are very difficult. And there is The processes that are laid out are very bureaucratic, and it's not an easy thing to do. But that doesn't mean that within these countries that these debates should not be happening, as you say. I think, you know, in some countries post-communism, there was a huge surge of optimism that this was going to be, the solution was found, and we have now achieved what needed to be achieved. And really that's never the case, because really it's nation building. What you're doing is nation building. And you're building up institutions again that have been hollowed out. So again, these debates have to be held. The debates within society around what is necessary to give us the institutions that reflect our beliefs now. And again, it comes back to, what do we believe is right for people? What are our beliefs fundamentally that we need, ourselves and then as a society, to hold us together, to develop and to hold us together? And that's why I think, you know, these things are difficult for Europe.
Yeah.
Because up to the accession of Eastern European member states, it was all very clear, and it was all very, you know, it was very clear that Western democracies were Western democracies. Some countries, like Portugal and Spain, had come out of dictatorships. Some, like ourselves, had come out of, actually, I think we were the only one that came out of post-colonialism. But others came out of Second World War and things that were absolutely terrifying. So all of these had time. There was time to develop the institutions and time to develop institutions that reflected where people were now. And there was this understanding of what the World War did. And when people addressed these things in the 1950s, they understood that where they wanted to be was free. And it was personal freedom that was important. Whereas under the communist system, it was more about, there was a certain degree of repression.
A certain degree, yes.
But it was subjugating the personal to the state. And that takes time.
You mentioned Article 7, and you know, I can't stop from asking. These countries that have been under Article 7 proceedings, what they argue is that they uphold the EU values. There's nothing wrong with the values. It's just absurd how the Commission sees the enforcement of those values, and that we should really have maybe a judicial, if we look at Hungary, a judicial solution from the European Court of Justice telling us what is rule of law. Is it really the way the Commission sees it, or is it also the way Hungary and Poland and Romania and many other countries see it? What does it take to have an independent justice system? Does it mean that we should have absolutely no interlinks between politicians, political appointments, governmental appointments, and the judiciary? Or does it actually mean that in practice, those courts have to act independently? And furthermore, prosecutors should also act independently and not be political weapons used against competitors. And how do we measure that? Do we measure it by the way people vote? If people vote for me, it means my policies are the right ones? Because that, I think, is actually a challenge in handling some of these situations. Not the Romanian one necessarily, but others in the region.
That question is definitely bigger than me. And it's something that the EU is grappling with. Yeah. I think that is bigger than any single individual at the moment. I think there are basic things in this that are important, and they are the institutions that we have that look at these things, including the Venice Commission, Council of Europe. The Commission is part of it, but it comes to the Commission actually much later. Some of this has to do with the European Court of Justice. Yeah. So these are institutions that think about these things deeply and come to views on the basis of EU law. And that's one thing. But we all know that the world is not simply based on law. It's based on politics. It's based on all sorts of other factors, including economy, social frameworks. you know, there's a whole range of things that come together to make a society. And when you listen to some of the arguments from member states who believe they are fully compliant with rule of law, this is their belief, absolutely. There is no, I know that Europe is looking at this in terms of a new rule of law mechanism to kind of look at how this debate can evolve, I think, in a way
whether
that
we should or we shouldn't have recipes that apply cross-country.
Yes, but the other side of that is also this conflict. Again, you have an adversarial. I think we need to get away from this adversarial thing as well, where one is telling another, because
Do it my way.
Exactly, because all judicial systems in Europe are different. I mean, we have a common law system in Ireland. So I suppose the basic thing is, though, what is the outcome of your system? Is the outcome justice for individuals in that system? Does rule of law apply to governments as well as to individuals? I think it's outcomes that need to be addressed rather than actually the mechanisms of getting there. So I think you can get into a very big legal debate as to, you know, is our legal system, does it stand up to the criteria of Western Europe or whatever? But fundamentally, it's about your outcome. Will an individual be treated before the courts in the exact same way? Will the investigation of the individual be the exact same for everyone? There are things, if a prosecutor investigates something, does that prosecutor have the support of the system behind them so that they can carry out their prosecutions independently? Does the judicial system operate independently in that it can treat everybody equally and still have the backing of the system behind them, that individual judges or individual prosecutors can operate on the basis of justice for all? And these are the things I think that are important. I think it's the outcomes of these things that are important, rather than the legal argument about whether the exact same judicial system applies, and that thing of connections between judiciary and politics and governments, and is our outcome good? Does our outcome deliver what we need to deliver?
Does it work?
Is it justice? Does it work?
Because you can also link it with the issues of accountability. You know, there's a lot of discussions around accountability of the judiciary. I mean, to whom are they accountable? Definitely not to the people, because we don't vote for them here in Romania and most, you know,
in the Irish
member
system,
states.
this is difficult because you have to have an independent judiciary.
Yeah.
You cannot have a judiciary that is afraid of government, that if a judge makes a decision that the government doesn't agree with, that judge can be suspended. You have separation of powers for a very good reason. So you have to have an independent judiciary. You have to have, now, accountability within a judiciary is really difficult, because decision-making and decisions of courts have to be judiciable. If a lower court makes a decision, it has to be appealable. So it has to be appealable to the next court. And eventually you end up with a Supreme Court decision. And you have to have a Supreme Court that is above everything, because if a judge makes a mistake in a lower court, that's fine. There are
remedies.
There are remedies. So you have to have a Supreme Court that's independent and that is that people have confidence in. But this idea, you will always have public commentary on judicial decisions. You will always have newspapers talking about the outcome of a trial, and that's fine. Judges need to have that public scrutiny. There has to be, in all our systems, you need to have...
And get used to it.
Justice before the public.
Yeah.
So people can attend a court, members of the public can attend a court and view for themselves justice and operation.
And have an opinion on what the court has done.
Absolutely, that's all absolutely fine, as long as that, you know, it's not sub judice, and that the opinion is articulated in a way that's within the law. That's absolutely fine. And that's really your accountability. You know, an independent judiciary is what it is. It's an independent judiciary.
Let me remind our viewers that we're still waiting for their questions via our link. Before we get to that part of our discussion, let me move to another sensitive area, which is gender issues. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact of EU, of being part of the EU on women, let's say, in Ireland?
I suppose the position of women in Ireland up to joining the EU was, I suppose this was articulated in a speech in 1948, I think it was, by a Prime Minister at the time, but it was really the place of women was in the home. And women really, their primary duty and their primary care was within the family. In Ireland, up to before we joined the EU, legally, if a woman was employed in the public service, if she got married, or when she got married, or if she got married, she had to leave the public service. So equality of opportunity really wasn't there in terms of equal pay. And this was reflected in the numbers. I think in the early 1970s, the number of women in the workforce was around 30,000. I think within 10 years, it was maybe 10 or 15 years, it was 300,000. And of course, today it's very different. So EU membership changed the position of women, I think, or helped change. I mean, a lot of this is societal as well. I mean, you can't...
Generational.
It's not... But the legal position and the legal framework was an EU framework that Ireland had to adopt and did adopt in the 1970s. So, I suppose, in some ways, it is taking Irish society time to reflect this. Childcare in Ireland is not good. Childcare for women in the workforce is very difficult. It's very expensive. The supports for women in the workforce are probably, people still depend on family to look after children, all of these things. People would still say that women are not in equal numbers in the higher positions in business and public sector, although I think that is really changing in the public sector. So all of these things, I think Europe really helped the position of women in society. But Ireland as a society really changed. Again, not just due to Europe, but to an opening. Like, part of this is psychological. Ireland was very inward looking before we joined the EU, and our horizons were expanded after EU membership. And a lot of it has to do with becoming part of the wider world, the society of the wider world. And for women, we had 2 referendums in the last few years. One had to do with abortion rights and one had to do with marriage equality.
Yeah, quite impressive.
And it's just very different. I mean, from a society in the 1950s and 60s that was very dominated by the church and that was very dominated by the ethos of the church. We have become much more egalitarian, I think, and much more into how people live their lives in freedom and should have the freedom to live their lives. I should say as well that when you attract a lot of foreign companies into Ireland, the structure of your society changes. We went from being almost entirely Irish, as in 100% Irish, up to 90, again, before we joined the EU, to today where you have 16% of our population was not born on the island of Ireland. And that has been, for us, a very big change. And for me, who grew up in that time previously, it's been a hugely positive change. And Romanian people have contributed to this enormously as well. We have around, I think, 50, the numbers, we don't know exactly, 50 to 70,000 Romanians live in Ireland. And that has been hugely positive for us. And a lot of them, again, a lot of people have come in from Eastern Europe, a lot of Polish, a lot of Lithuanian, Latvian, Northern European, as well as Southern European. And that has changed the nature of our society for the better. So all of these things have helped.
We talked a lot about the pre-COVID Europe. Now, if we come to nowadays, how was the EU perceived in Ireland when it comes to COVID response?
I think initially the COVID, health is a national competence. And I think what happened was each country at the very beginning struggled with this. And it took a little time for Europe to really find, and this is not a long time, we're talking days and weeks here, but it just took a little time for Europe to find what it contributed to the addressing COVID issues in member states. I would say, firstly, the response of some member states when they were helping other member states and other countries, like Romania's response in terms of Moldova and in terms of Italy, was extremely positive. And I think member states, when they reached out to other member states where they could help, Germany, I know, helped, I think, Italy and France. Spain has received help from other bilaterally. But once Europe found the role that it needed in terms of PPE, in terms of now working together in terms of a vaccine, in terms of what it could do to support member states, I think that has been really positive. I think it took a little bit of time, as I say, for this to really become part of the response. The second part of that, of course, is helping member states recover economically. And in that, I think Europe has been really fantastic.
Impressive,
really impressive. It has brought forward a response very early. It has addressed really the core issues that member states needed to address. And I think everybody, within the EU is very glad that it is part of the EU now, that this can to respond to such a threat together. I think it really.
If you're talking about governments, I agree. If you're talking about people, I don't know that we got that message across. How much effort the EU makes to actually keep things on track?
Yes, I think that's an absolute fair point. I think, and the EU struggles to get its message across because sometimes positive messages are harder to get across than negative messages. If you're always trying to put forward a positive message, sometimes you lose credibility because people
even
think,
if it's true.
Even if it's true. And you have forces that are not always pro-EU who want to send out a negative message about the EU. So messaging is very difficult in the modern world in terms of getting pro-EU messages out there. And because we all know what the difficult issues are. And solutions to difficult issues are never simple. Because usually a difficult issue has come after a lot of things have gone wrong. And they have gone wrong for different reasons. So the EU, people can come with a problem and say the EU isn't addressing this problem. But for that problem to have gotten to that point where it comes to the EU's attention,
it really be a big problem.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
So these things, and sometimes, and I think in the modern world in particular, people like simple solutions. They like somebody to say, if you do that, that is fixed.
That's how our brain is made.
It's
to strongly believe that there's always a simple solution.
And
unfortunately,
it's rare, and it's especially when you have 27 other member states. You simply cannot impose your solution on others. You have to negotiate. And negotiations always involve compromise. And that is where all of these things come down to.
And actually, compromise is good.
Compromise sometimes
keeps people around the table.
It keeps people around the table, but it also makes you address issues that are uncomfortable for you.
Exactly.
Because sometimes, if you have your simple solution that suits you, you don't address all of the complexities around it.
Yeah.
And these are the things that can lead you into difficulty later on. And a negotiated solution generally addresses all of the things that you haven't thought of in your simple solution.
So we gave compromise a bad name for nothing, really.
Well, in Ireland this is very interesting because we had simple solutions to complex problems. After the treaty that I spoke about at the very beginning, 6 counties, Northern Ireland, remained part of the United Kingdom. And the narrative in the south of Ireland for many years was those 6 counties should just be part of Ireland and we just needed a unitary state. And really, we had 30 years of conflict where people tried to impose that, where that solution was seen as well, I wouldn't say tried to impose that, that's unfair, but that was seen as the outcome, the best outcome to the conflict. When in reality, you had the John Hume way, which was respect diversity and respect difference, and then come to a compromise that can actually accommodate difference. And that's what you have to do. And that's why you have to address different relationships. And then you have structures that will address relationships, and then you can move on.
You talked about messages getting distorted, and I wanted to raise the issue of fake news and propaganda and manipulation with you. Do you see that as an issue in Ireland, especially in relation with the EU? Or rather, does it stay under the water until it emerges and then it eats us all?
I think that's a good point. I don't think there's any, and I think probably democratic society in the world at the moment that is immune from either fake news or what you would call people articulating views, I suppose particularly in social media and in the internet, that are not always in the best interests of everybody, and that don't always accurately reflect the difficulties that are there in managing issues. And I suppose as the world becomes a more complex place and as states take on broader roles, I mean, in the old days, the state took on very simple roles in terms of economic development and maybe some social roles, and before they took on a social role, it was simply about economies and defence and security and these things. But as societies, as governments and states take on deeper roles and are involved in more aspects of our lives, like data, the world becomes really, really complicated. And when you're talking about complicated things, again, it's people who have simple solutions. And, when the EU comes out with solutions, our responses to difficult issues like data, it's very easy to adopt a very glib, one-line rejection.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we are. And it is very difficult for states to do that. In terms of Ireland and fake news and whatever, I think there is a broad consensus in Ireland around our society and what people expect from our society. And a lot of that has to do with fairness. And as I said earlier, good delivery of public services. Where the state fails to do that, then you get a lot of dissatisfaction. And I think a lot of the activity online on this has to do with articulating that dissatisfaction, which, you can't say is a terrible thing. But I don't think we have an undermining, or we have had an undermining of our institutions at this stage, in the same way as
you've seen in other
as you've seen elsewhere.
We have received a question from Mr. Otaru related to the first rejection of the Lisbon Treaty in Ireland. How do we explain that when Irish people are so enthusiastic about the EU?
Well, Irish people are enthusiastic about the EU, but they're not unquestioning. So when there are issues around that had to be dealt with in terms of integration, in terms of accommodation, in terms of single market, all of these things have an impact on a country. We are among the member states that go to the people. We have a written constitution. So every big decision in Europe, we have to put to the people. And the arguments around these, the Irish people are really well informed, and they are really well informed on specifics of issues. And if politicians aren't on top of the specifics of issues, then people get very sceptical. So when issues are being done, whether it's to change the balance within the institutions in terms of decision making, when things have to be done to accommodate a larger EU, when things have to be done, that people say impinge on our interests, then you're wondering, then they wonder, and they will vote.
Mm-hmm.
I think what our job in all of this has been to explain, like when decisions have been rejected by the Irish people and we have gone back to the Irish people, we have done things to try and find out what were the concerns of the Irish people. And we have tried then to get accommodations at a European level that would address those concerns. So it hasn't been that the response of the Irish people has been just ignored and we've gone back and just asked them again. Mm-hmm. It's a question of, what are the things...
Why don't they agree?
Why don't you?
Yeah.
And if you don't agree, we'll put it to you again. But these are the things, we did try to find out what are the things that concerned you. We've addressed those concerns, or tried to address those concerns, and now we'll come back to you again, because we believe this is important.
So is that mainly the job of the government or of politicians, charismatic politicians, to try to listen and address the concerns of the people and present again the same
I would
proposal?
have to say that we have a very strong civic society in Ireland, and we have a lot of organisations. Like, politicians in Ireland don't get away with an awful lot without civic society holding them to account, as well as being held to account at a parliamentary level. Mm-hmm. So in all of this, we have civic societies or civic organisations and civic society organisations that are pro-EU as well, mm-hmm. and who really want to explain Europe to people. And I think there has to be a national conversation. And in those terms, post-Lisbon, there was a national conversation about this. And you do have to go out to people and hold events like this and similar to this, where people talk about the issues. And these are really important in getting messages across around why, to have an in-depth discussion with people. It's not just...
Hear them out,
and then kind of look at what needs to be addressed, but also to hear out the politician. Because very often politicians are very sophisticated in their thinking around Europe, and they have really important views. And, we should never dismiss the views of politicians on Europe or on big issues, because it's not just simply a matter of them distilling down to the core things. They can have very detailed and sophisticated views on what they want to achieve.
So as we are moving towards the end of this delightful conversation, if you were to talk to the younger generation, to students, to their professors even, what would you say their role is in all of this? Are they just spectators? How do we include them? How do they become significant? How do they become part of this process, rather than just simply looking at it from afar?
I really think individuals have to look to themselves first. What are your beliefs? What are your core beliefs? What are the things you want to achieve for yourself? What is the impact you want to make? And then you look at, if your belief coincides or aligns with European beliefs, I think that's fair. Then you have a position to articulate. And then you can look at what others are saying. And are others saying things that are true? Are they, as you'd say, benign? Are they good things? Are they actually destructive? Or, where do you fit into all of this? Because essentially you have to have a view yourself of what you believe. So for anybody, for a student, for an academic, for a professor, but for anybody in society, they should be looking at the world as it is, and what are the things that are affecting your world? And is the EU affecting your world in a good way or a bad way? Now, my contention would be that the EU has affected Ireland in a really good way. And I should say Erasmus,
Yes.
mention Erasmus as being a fantastic innovation.
We take many things for granted, Erasmus was always there. Well, it wasn't.
But it wasn't. And
it
now
wasn't.
It is, and it is fantastic. And these are things that I think...
Traveling, yeah? freely.
Freely.
Okay, pre-COVID, but still
But
freely.
freely. I mean, and roaming charges.
Yeah, roaming charges,
communications.
energy connections.
These make everything so much easier for European citizens. And we tend, once something is done, we tend to
Take it for granted.
take it for granted. But we really should think sometimes about, what are our core beliefs as individuals? Do we believe in freedom? Do we believe in the core things? Do we believe in other people being able to live their lives in a way within the law and, all of these things, but in a way that doesn't, if they don't impinge on our...
Maybe we shouldn't impinge on theirs.
Maybe we should leave people alone.
Yeah. Let them be.
Let them be. But the other thing then is, as simple messages for academics, I think they should take part in the debate. They should make their views known.
And also bring these debates in their classrooms.
And
I think
have
that's
some energy
essential.
about it. Have some energy about it, because these things are important. If we vacate this space, if we don't say these things, there are others there who will say very different things that will actually make our world not better.
Beautiful. Let's end on this note. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this delightful conversation.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you very much for watching us. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.